Hey, good to see you. Thanks for coming. This is another episode of Wireframe brought to you by Design Systems House. I am your host, Donnie D'Amato. Thanks for coming today. We're going to be talking about something called configuration hell. This is something that bothers the crap out of me, and we're going to be talking about it today because there was a post that I saw, I think it was this morning or maybe yesterday, shared by another design system practitioner, and it triggered me a little bit. Not necessarily initially, just because of the initial title and stuff like that. Usually this person posts some really interesting stuff and shares some things around the community. Philip Lovelace, I think the name was. I've seen the name pop up a whole bunch, and I think he shared a whole bunch of stuff from mine as well, so shout out to him. But the person who wrote the article, different person, we're going to be looking at the article in a little bit. But the article is talking a lot about design systems and AI, right? Now, just fill it with buzzwords, why don't you, right? That's exactly what this is doing, right? You got the design systems buzzword that we had for a few years, and that, trickled out, and now AI is the buzzword. So you put those two things together, and obviously you're going to get some eyes on something like this. But, as you can tell, the topic that we're talking about is not necessarily design systems and AI, talking about configuration hell. So when I read the post, and I'll show the post, but I'd rather, folks either read it themselves or, have your own opinions about design systems and AI. But what I want to get down to, particularly today, is this idea of configuration hell. And what I mean by that, if you don't already know, is the act of trying to configure a system in order for it to do what you want it to do. Back when I was first developing stuff, there really wasn't much configuration. And when I say that, I'm talking mostly from a front-end perspective. Right? From a front-end perspective, all you need to do is write an HTML file, a CSS file, and a JavaScript file. Could you argue that code is configuration? Yes, you could. But I feel like there's a lot more, I guess, direct connection to what you type versus what you output when it comes to just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. When a process like Webpack, or I should say a framework like Webpack, came on the scene, that's where, at least for me, it started providing a great divide, right? Between I'm coding over here, some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but it's not updating where it would normally update because I have this layer in the middle that's supposed to be helping me out. And Webpack has never helped me out. Never. At least not directly. Maybe indirectly through when Storybook would use Webpack or any other system using Webpack. But what's important with most of those is that it was already pre-configured, right? In most of those cases. There's plenty of other cases where Storybook would require some other configuration because your app was a little different or whatever. And it started to get into this ecosystem of what I call configuration hell, or what people call configuration hell. It's something that's very common, where you have to go into the framework or go into the settings or some file, and you have to start adding values in order to tell the system what to do. And I always thought that was ridiculous, because we should have best practices in order to do something, right? I mean, admittedly, originally in HTML and CSS, there was only a few ways to introduce CSS into the HTML page, right? You do the the link tags, you do inline styles, or inline into the HTML elements themselves. Now, inline into the HTML elements themselves, we avoid that normally, right? So from there's only two other things. You either write the styles inside of the page, or you link to them externally, right? Those are the only real two options. Since then, we've had a couple more options that are through JavaScript and stuff like that to add adopted style sheets and replace sync and all other BS. But before that, we just had Webpack in the way of getting my CSS on the page when I could do it myself. Like, what are you doing for me? Why do I have to tell you that this is CSS? It ends in .css. Can't you already know that? Why do I have to tell you that .css files are CSS files, right? And that's the thing, that's the fundamental argument or frustration that I have. Why aren't these systems smart enough to interpret what we're doing in order for us to move forward, right? Why is it that we are required to learn configuration documentation and write configurations in order to get things done? We live in a new age world of technology where things should be smarter. And in many cases, they are ending up not smarter. Now, I will say that Vite, as a successor to Webpack, has done a much, much better job at this, right? Especially when it comes to the Astro ecosystem. In the Astro ecosystem, where most of my sites are being built, I don't have to touch the Vite config almost at all. There's been very rare occasions where I touch it for some reason. Usually, in any one of those configurations, I have to put in my domain name. Just site, my domain name, and that's all it needs in order to, work within the parameters of what I'm doing. And that's only because I use the site name or the site domain in some of the meta information like OG images and that kind of stuff, right? So I like to have a place to put that, and having that in the environment variables is really helpful. But past that, the large majority of my Astro/Vite config is very bare. And I love that. And everything just works. And that's how it should have been. Because if you want to do something complex or unique or different, then yes, that requires you to actually learn this stuff and dive in, right? That's with almost anything that's out there, right? There should be a kind of common directive that you take, and then there's an uncommon directive, right? It's like buying a car off the lot that you could just drive away with, or buying the pieces in order to build the car that you really want, and going through all the trials and tribulations of getting that out. Now, the reason that I'm bringing this up in the context of the article that I was mentioning earlier about AI and design systems is that in this article, and I'll share it in a minute, it begins to explain what you need to do in order for AI to understand your design system. And I've already been seeing a little bit of this in the space about explaining how these two things are going to be connected over time and what people are doing with this stuff, especially in the case of MCPs, and we'll see that in the article. But overall, what I'm seeing a lot of is more configuration hell, which doesn't make any sense to me, okay? And that's because I don't need to know about configuration anymore. All I need to do is ask AI. Why wouldn't AI know what's going on? AI knows how to read code, right? If it didn't know how to read code, we'd still be in what was effectively 2023 or 2024, right? If it didn't know how to do that, we wouldn't be in the situation right now where we would be able to generate our own code with new ideas and things like that. I was doing that, again, with DeltaZeus, my side project. A whole bunch of the back-end code that I'm unfamiliar with, it's generating, and it looks generally sane. There's a couple of things that I've questioned, but overall, there's working code in there, right? Well, how did it know that? Well, no one's creating docs, or not very few people are creating docs that are then going to inform what this stuff is, specifically for AI. These folks have created docs for humans, and the AI has read the human documentation in order to do this stuff. And I really truly believe that the human stuff is the middleman in this whole operation, right? Because when I now code in a thing like Claude, right? Really great example. I'm coding in Claude, I'm adding props to a particular component, and then in the ecosystem that I'm dealing with right now, my storybook doesn't know how to get the args table from those props. There's a weird configuration that's going on in there, wrapper, whatever you want to call it, and it's unable to get the props using React TypeScript docgen, which is what Storybook uses under the hood. It's unable to do that. But I can autocomplete those props that I just wrote in the Storybook story. Like that. There's no MCP that I saw that I connected. As far as I know, I didn't connect any one of those, right? And in fact, I'm not necessarily asking AI explicitly, hey, fill in the props here. I mean, I'm sure I could. But the autocomplete enough has understood that I just came from that earlier file, adding these props. I'm coming into this new file, I want to add the args table. It knows what the args table is, right? And it's doing it, right? So why are we spending time on this exercise of preparing information for AI? Preparing computers for computers. Doesn't make any sense. Just bottom line, doesn't make any sense, right? I should be able to point AI to my source code, and it should know what all that stuff is. Now, granted, will it know the best practices in order to, use a input field or to, have a loading state or any of that kind of stuff, the actual, user experience of the stuff? Potentially less so, okay? But when it comes to itemizing your components, providing the props for those components, providing the expected values for those components, right? If I have to duplicate that in any particular way, I've made a mistake. So it's very odd to me that we are in the process of creating files that are specifically for AI to read in order to figure out what's going on in the source code. And again, like I said, there's certain configurations that may make sense, right? When you're giving context to a particular AI and you say, hey, look, listen, don't use components outside of my system, right? You need to give AI some of that context sometimes, because otherwise it might start bringing in Tailwind and ShadCN in there and be like, oh, well, to do this, we need to do all that stuff, right? You sometimes need to give the context in order to know, what to do next. But that's, again, when we're talking about trying to compose something or your daily work or whatever, right, to make these kinds of things. But in order for the AI to know what to do, like where to get the resources from, it should already know, right? It should really already know. I shouldn't have to configure, here are the props for AI to read from. That's ridiculous to me. All right, let's go to the actual post right now and dive into what it's talking about. So here's the post. The post is called How to Build an AI Design System with MCP. It was published a day ago. It is apparently an 11-minute read, and let's get a little bit into it. So apparently Pierre, I think his name was right, Pierre? Did I see that? Yeah, Pierre has had some experience in design systems at scale. He worked at Fuse and then the Very Group, and then with Volvo and their design system, which I've known some pretty strong players in the design system over there, so that's cool. But he's explaining that, what we used to do is no longer enough in design systems. It has 3 layers of a design system, which we all know this kind of stuff. And here's something that I want to kind of really mention here is that, okay, coded library, we know we need this, right? Because the users are ultimately working with that coded library. So you know that you need a coded library, okay? Figma assets and tokens, I'm going to argue you don't need that, especially in a system in which you are using the coded component as the resource to, implement, new potential designs and things like that. We're probably not there yet when it really comes down to it, but if you think of an application like Framer that is effectively using coded components to create designs from and then can be published from there, right? You really don't need this layer, right? If you can have a WYSIWYG kind of experience that works with coded components, you don't really need this layer, okay? So I'm going to argue about that a little bit. But the reality of it is this current day and age, we do have a thing like Figma that's easier for designers to use, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's a world where we move away from that. And the last thing is guidelines and documentation. And I don't like this. And this is the thing I always argue about, because I don't believe now in the year 2025 about documentation. I believe about education, okay? Or at least that's what I used to believe. Let's bring it back here. I used to believe in education as the third tier or layer of the design system kind of collection of things that you need, okay? And the reason for that is that I saw that documentation isn't overall as helpful as we thought it might be. And I say that specifically because we see folks that are, trying to get things done. They don't have the time or the energy to peruse somebody's IA of documentation, no matter how beautiful it is, to find maybe a component that might work for them, to not understand the composition of that component, regardless of how detailed it is or how not detailed it is, and for them to otherwise be frustrated that I don't know how to use this thing overall. It's too complicated, it's too vast, it's too whatever, right? And the documentation can absolutely get in the way of a person trying to execute on something, right? If there's too much, too little, even the just right could fall on the wrong kind of side of the execution. So what's the answer there? Well, the answer there is actually just education, right? Because if you already know what to do, right, then you don't need the documentation. The documentation is more of a reference than it is a how-to at that point, right? So I always think about how I had to make a Tailwind plugin and found out that Tailwind's documentation makes very little reference to building a plugin. And it took me a few weeks of prompting AI to figure out how to build a plugin, right? And again, it must have saw this from other plugins that were out there. So I don't want documentation that was made in the eyes of somebody else. I want personalized education that helps me achieve the goal when it comes to a production environment, right? Again, if I'm just perusing a site and learning a little bit about it because I have some free time, that's different than me trying to execute on a task, right? I don't want to go ahead and get lost in documentation when I have to execute on a task. It is much faster if I'm educated about what I'm supposed to do, and especially in the context of what I'm doing, right? So the guidelines and documentation, it's old school. We need to think newer, and I hope he's getting to that. All right. Back to the post. Right, guidelines and documentation, Figma assets, tokens, code, okay. From static layers to responsive systems. All right, so now, keyword is now responsive. We're going to put all the keywords in here. AI is entering the picture. Limitations become more visible. Okay, right. So we're going to hopefully talk about this stuff here. So making the system AI-readable. To make the design system work with AI, two capabilities are required: structured data and intelligent retrieval. Okay. So I'm behind the intelligent retrieval for sure, but structured data, I don't know. Just like I said earlier, I'm not sure. All right. So I guess these are the three layers he's going to be trying to address with AI. So it's saying here, most design system content is written for humans, which means it is hard for tools to search, relate, and apply it in context. Okay, yeah, the design system content is definitely written for humans, yes. But AI is also now learned on context for humans, right? We didn't write in machine code and now AI is translating it into humans for us. It learned from human context in order to do what it's doing today. So, okay, there's a little bit on both sides though for this one. To change this, you have to move the content to a database prepared for RAG, retrieval augmented generation. I've heard of RAG, don't know what it is. Where the tool first looks up the most relevant entries in your own knowledge base and then use those facts to answer. Well, isn't that just search? Isn't that just normal search? Why are we making it complicated? Right? And I'm imagining that there's some sort of like vector database kind of relational situation that's happening there that make it more optimized. But ultimately, as a person, I just type in the search bar for something that looks relevant. Hopefully I find some things, and then I'll review those things and find the most applicable one to what I'm doing, right? Isn't that the same thing? Yeah. So all the stuff that he's saying here, the component describes, platform applies to the author, last updated date, tags, accessibility, interaction state. Yeah, it's already all on the documentation site. And in fact, if I go through each one of these things, right? Let's talk about this, right? The component it describes. All right, well, the component it describes, you could get that from the package JSON, right? We're talking about JavaScript. You can get that from the package JSON. The platform it applies to, well, it's probably web. Again, you could do native stuff, whatever, but we're going to assume it's web. The author, okay, that's probably in the package JSON. The last updated date, well, I'm assuming that you could probably get that from the Git history. That's in code. Tags such as accessibility. Okay, so accessibility is a rough one. That's hard, totally hard, but I think AI is not really doing a great job of that either, and that's because humans aren't doing a great job in that. Interaction, you can get that from CSS, right? Interaction states that you're going to be visible in there. You can get that from CSS and what's going on in there. States, you can get that from the way that state is handled within the component. I guess it's including with feedback. Performance, what do you do with performance when it comes to the guidelines and documentation? I mean, I'm assuming that's like best practices. So yeah, okay, that needs to be codified potentially. And content styles, yeah, same, okay. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of stuff in here that we can already get from code and structured code already exists that we don't need to make something else different. Figma access to tokens, just get rid of it. Just get rid of it. Making your code component machine readable. Okay, can't wait to hear this. Human-friendly code is not always machine-friendly. How is that possible? What is going on? Right? Like, what is going on? Look at me for a second. How is human-friendly code, it's code, meant for a machine, not machine-friendly? Doesn't make any sense. But you know what? I'm going to read the rest of this paragraph. I'm going to see what's going on. Hold on. Make components predictable by surfacing props. Yes, you have to do that. States, you have to do that. Token bindings, you have to do that. And accessibility attributes also have to all be there in ways an AI coding tool can discover. No, AI coding should already know what these things are. I shouldn't need to expose these things differently than what I'm already doing right now. Adopt a consistent schema so that names, variants, and constraints mean the same thing across the library. Yes, that is a design system. With that in place, an AI coding tool can get the available components, choose correct variant, map tokens, generate a lot. No, I'm not doing this work. No, absolutely not. Now we're talking the MCP. I just learned what an MCP is a couple of weeks ago, and unfortunately, when people ask people what an MCP is, everyone always says, oh, it's just an API. That's like the easiest answer, but it's not the most complete answer. And unfortunately, I'm unable to explain the complete answer, but all I do know is that thinking about it just as an API where things talk to each other isn't enough. But let's go on to this stuff here. So structured requests, each AI tool needs a custom integration. MCP provides a predictable interface. Right, okay. So yeah, so there's some hosts that I'm assuming is your computer. Maybe, I don't even know, because I see cursor in here, but I also see MCP client. And I just like, why does it just say your computer? But then there's some protocol, some API in between all of the systems that you could talk to, right? Now there's different MCPs per layer, right? So here he's talking about the documentation layer part, right? So the documentation MCP, where you use your RAG store as resources for a compact set of tools. This is absolute Greek for me, but it sounds like all of that stuff, right? Return at least an ID, a title, version, updated at component ref platform tags, and canonical URL. That's a package JSON. What else do you want? I don't know. Figma, get rid of it, like I said. Component MCP, which is, again, the code stuff, right? Expose your component catalog and token schema as read-only resources, right? List components, we know what those are. Get component, yes, we can get a component, it's exported. Suggest variant. Well, I know what variants there are. I can only suggest what variant it is based on the context you provide from like a best practices thing. Again, that's from a user experience thing that is effectively outside of what we're talking about so far. It would be something that you would need to include. And then apply tokens, we already know what the tokens are. Again, I don't want to configure this, right? I don't want to duplicate this information, right? Unifying the servers. Oh my God, this is already too much work, right? Point the editor, I'm assuming this is the code editor, at the documentation, Figma, and component servers. Keeps the setup light. These are three things that I need to connect. How is this light? What else would I need to connect? Keep publish, and oh, I don't know what that means. I don't know what this means. Okay, let's move down on here. Okay, regardless of the pattern, the behavior lives in the IDE. Yes. Okay. Oh, it's trying to tell me about MCP stuff because it says rules tell the AI coding tool how to move across layers, what to trust first. Right, okay, so these are the rules, right? This is what I was talking about earlier about saying, look, I only want you to use design system components. I don't want you to use things that are outside the system, right? This is saying the order of stuff. That's cool. That's cool. Do not invent tokens or component names, right? I mean, that would be nice if AI wasn't hallucinating already. Right, prepare a change plan. Okay, cool. I don't know if that's necessary to happen all of the time. Return a trace that includes the guideline ID and version, the variable collection and mode, component, links to the design frame. Why? What does this all do? What is this trace? I don't know what a trace is. I don't know what that is. Okay, what changes for designers and developers, right? For designers, faster path from Figma to runnable prototypes? Yeah, there would be if you just, use a framer or something like that instead, right, where everything's code already. Brand and accessibility compliance is enforced at generation time, not after review. Sure, yeah, I mean, if everything's aligned, variations, name, yeah, it's a design system. Content UX writing guidelines by system rules, that is also potentially part of existing guidelines for content writing, right? We have systems already that are doing editing with AI. I know of that because I looked at them for my book. So that's not something that I need to necessarily define outside of what humans are looking for, as far as I know. Ability to design through code when needed. Yes, I mean, that's what I was talking with Framer. Traceable decisions. Every suggestion cites guidelines, token. Okay, so you're talking about citing. Okay, so if we're talking about citing where you got this information from, that's big, right? And that normally would exist if you have a documentation site at some URL. It's also entirely possible that instead of getting those kinds of things, we actually cite at the source code instead, right? A link to some GitHub source code with some lines highlighted. I think that's totally reasonable. Or if you want to generate a documentation site just for the heck of it, you could do that too, no problem. I mean, Storybook technically already does that right now. Simpler maintenance, updates the tokens, yes, 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 sure, of course it does. Automated contributions back to the system, validated against, yes, of course, yeah. Alignment across teams, yes, that would be wonderful. And then this, for developers, stronger reviews, because this is all stuff, yeah, of course we get all this. We could get all this right now, right? So, all right. Where the field is heading, this is going to be explaining a couple of MCPs that are happening, okay? Talking about AI agents themselves doing the work, cool. What changes when the system starts to think for you? Yeah, I mean, that's where I want to go. That's where I want to go. Okay. I'm going to come back to me here because, look, I shouldn't need to configure this. That's the bottom line. I shouldn't need to configure this. We are in an age right now where AI has understood the stuff that we're doing, figured out the context, and has learned, okay? It's learned from what we've already done. So it's weird to me for us to spend time in a totally separate format, as this is suggesting, in order for it to learn more or learn differently. That's, I think, what I really mean, right? Because it's not, it's the same, right? Learn more and learn differently at the same time, right? It would be a lot more efficient, again, for AI to just learn what we're doing from the source code at the largest percent of it. And again, there are exceptions to that I'm aware of, right? Again, when we're talking about user experience and what the best practice is to do, that's choosing the right thing based on all the existing context, right? That has nothing to do about what are the props on this component. We don't know what the props are on the component, it's in the source code, right? The annoying thing is trying to find where the props are in the source code, right? But if AI already has a direct line to those props in the source code and can surface them very quickly, right? That's it. That's it, we're done, right? Why would I ever tell it anything else? So I believe that if we're going to be doing this work in order to configure in the future, we should be configuring things that aren't necessarily clear through our existing resources, right? I do not want to duplicate resources. That's the dry principle, right? Do not repeat yourself. So we shouldn't be repeating ourselves. I should be able to write the code as it is in my editor, and these new smarter systems should be able to figure out what that source code is all about as far as possible without me duplicating any of those efforts. The most I should be introducing there is the gaps. What's not in my source code that I need to expose to the AI such that when a human interacts with that AI, they actually do receive the full picture, right? I don't think tokens is part of that. I don't think props is part of that, right? I don't think listing your components is part of that, okay? And I think we should be just focusing on the stuff that's going to make us more efficient, because AI is meant to be helping us. We're not really, at this point, meant to be helping AI. We've already done that. Realistically, we've already done that, right? We've have a huge corpus of information that was available on the internet, whether found legally or illegally, that AI has learned and trained from and has understood, and that allows us to ask it questions and understand what we're getting at. And we're able to give it new contexts by literally just pointing it at stuff and going, look at the stuff that's here, right? ChatGPT did not learn Storybook through some MCP. It just looked at what exists in Storybook today and figured it out, okay? So I think there could be some benefit to MCP when it comes to unique things that the current models of AI have no idea about. But design systems, there's nothing unique there. We've been doing this for a long time, you know? Been doing it for a long time. I mean, you know, ask Nathan Curtis how long he's been doing it. And there's plenty of documentation, plenty of Nathan's articles from Medium that you could find that are potentially informing not just AI, but have been informing our systems for a really long time. So I can understand MCP server for something that is completely unique and original and something that hasn't been introduced into, excuse me, the AI landscape. But there isn't a lot going on when it comes to design systems and you know, uniqueness necessarily. And there's a reason for that, of course, right? Because if we did something too unique, then it's too hard to follow. Case in point, mise-en mode, right? Mise-en mode is a unique concept, and because of that, it is hard to follow. It really is, you know, when you get into the weeds of it. So I understand that very deeply, and again, that's why I understand this concept very deeply, where if we're going to make it at all, we should try to make it easy. And again, introducing this whole new ecosystem, again, doesn't make sense. It's making me feel like Web3 with the blockchain and the NFTs and all this new configuration in order to make digital money that was going on, right? It seemed like it was a thing, but then when we started asking some questions, it all kind of fell apart. This is kind of smelling like that to me, right? The MCP kind of direction. I'm a little scared. But I guess we'll see how it shakes out, right? I do appreciate the folks that are diving into this new stuff and really adopting it. I'm going to actually shout out TJ Pitre for doing a lot of MCP work with the MCP for Figma, and I think we're with Storybook as well, and really trying to push the envelope when it comes to AI in our practice. So it's a shout out for him there to really get in and adopt this kind of stuff. But me personally, a little skeptic about it because I'm expecting a lot more. Right? I use AI on a regular basis. I've been using it a lot recently for, again, the side projects. And I see the ability, right? I see the ability without me doing a lot of work. I see the ability of it being able to reference stuff that I'm pretty confident doesn't have any MCPs hanging around. So it makes me wonder, you know? But ultimately, I don't want to do any more configurations. I don't think anyone really wants to do configurations, again, unless they want to, you know, do something more unique, right? Something that isn't the norm. And I think we would have liked to have learned from the Webpack and Vite transition, right? Where Webpack is highly configurable, but needed to be highly configured, right? Where Vite, similar, highly configurable, but doesn't need to be highly configured, right? Just works right out of the box, right? Makes it really easy. So we should have the same kind of thing and have the ability to, you know, add more. But if it's not easy, then it's too hard. But let me know what you think in the comments. I really want to know how you feel about this stuff because AI is obviously a big part of what we're doing today in 2025. Play nice down there. And like I said, I will have a real outro at some point soon once I come up for air because I'm super busy, had some, you know, work to do today in terms of updating some things and my side projects. And after I sign off today, I'm going to be diving back into some more things I need to do around the house. So trying to stay on top of it all. But thank you for joining me today. It was wonderful having you, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.